The crystal chandelier in the Peninsula Hotel's private dining room caught the light as Richard Hastings's face turned crimson, his voice rising to a pitch that made the sommelier freeze mid-pour. "You incompetent! Do you have any idea who I am? This is a $5 billion negotiation, and you just spilled water on documents worth more than you'll make in your pathetic lifetime." The black woman in the hotel's uniform stood perfectly still, water pitcher in hand, her name tag reading Diana Price. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize again, just met his eyes with a calm that seemed to infuriate him further. "People like you," Hastings snarled, his words dripping with venom he didn't bother to hide, "should learn your place. You're here to serve, not to—" "Richard." The voice from the doorway was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. Everyone turned. The man standing there was in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with silver hair and dark brown skin. His expression was unreadable, but something in his stillness made the room feel suddenly smaller. Hastings's face went from red to white in an instant, because the man in the doorway was Marcus Okonkwo, the Nigerian billionaire Hastings had been courting for 6 months. The man whose signature on tonight's joint venture agreement would make Hastings the most powerful tech CEO in Silicon Valley. And the woman Hastings had just screamed at, the woman he'd called "people like you," was Marcus Okonkwo's daughter. But to understand how a moment of racist arrogance destroyed a billion-dollar empire in less than 60 seconds, and how the woman Richard Hastings dismissed as the help had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time, we need to go back 6 months, to the day Diana Okonkwo decided to teach a very expensive lesson about respect. 6 months earlier, Hastings Technologies occupied 4 floors of a glass tower in San Francisco's financial district. Richard Hastings, 47, had built his company from a Stanford dorm room into a $12 billion enterprise specializing in cloud infrastructure for Fortune 500 companies. He was ruthless, brilliant, and possessed the kind of casual arrogance that came from never hearing the word no. His problem in early 2024 was Africa. Every major tech company was expanding into African markets. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, but they all faced the same challenge: infrastructure, internet connectivity, power grids, government relationships, cultural understanding. Hastings Technologies had the software, but lacked the on-ground network to compete. Enter Marcus Okonkwo. Okonkwo had built his telecommunications empire across 17 African nations over 30 years. His company, Pan-Africa Connect, owned fiber-optic networks, data centers, and relationships with every government from Lagos to Nairobi. He was considering a joint venture with an American tech partner to expand cloud services across the continent, a market projected to be worth $50 billion by 2030. Hastings wanted that partnership desperately. The pitch meeting happened in March at Hastings Technologies headquarters. Okonkwo arrived with a small delegation, including his chief legal counsel and a young woman Hastings assumed was an assistant. She was in her late 20s, wearing a modest business suit, carrying a leather portfolio, and taking notes throughout the presentation. Hastings barely glanced at her. His presentation was impressive. Market projections, technical capabilities, revenue models. Okonkwo listened carefully, asked sharp questions, and revealed nothing of his thoughts. As the meeting concluded, he said he'd consider the proposal and be in touch. Over the next months, negotiations continued through intermediaries, lawyers, executives, technical teams. The deal grew more complex: joint infrastructure investment, profit-sharing agreements, governance structures. Hastings pushed aggressively for terms that gave him operational control. His team warned him that Okonkwo was notoriously principled, that relationships mattered more than leverage in African business culture. Principals don't close billion-dollar deals, Hastings told his CFO. Pressure does. By September, they were close to final terms. Okonkwo suggested they meet in person to sign. Neutral territory, somewhere elegant. The Peninsula Hotel in Beverly Hills. Private dining room. October 15th, Hastings agreed immediately. He didn't know that Okonkwo had one final test planned. He didn't know that the young woman he'd ignored in that March meeting, the one he'd dismissed as an assistant, was Diana Okonkwo, Marcus's youngest daughter. Stanford MBA, 3 years running African operations for her father's company, and the person Marcus trusted most to evaluate character. And he certainly didn't know that Diana had specifically requested to work that dinner as hotel staff, wearing a uniform instead of a power suit, to see how Richard Hastings treated people he considered beneath him. Diana Okonkwo grew up between two worlds. Born in London, educated in Swiss boarding schools, summer breaks in Lagos with her grandmother. Her father had built his empire through a combination of technical brilliance and something he called character assessment, the ability to judge whether someone would be a trustworthy partner when circumstances got difficult. In business, Marcus told his 3 children repeatedly, "Everyone performs well when things are easy. You learn who people really are when they face stress, when they have power over someone weaker, when they think no one important is watching." Diana learned this lesson young. At 14, during a family vacation in Paris, she watched a wealthy American businessman berate a hotel porter for being too slow with luggage. Her father had been considering investing in that man's company. After witnessing the incident, Marcus walked away from a $200 million deal. "I don't do business with men who punch down," he explained to Diana later. "Because eventually, when things get hard, they'll punch you too." Diana studied this principle throughout her education. At Stanford Business School, she wrote her thesis on corporate culture and character-based leadership. She interviewed CEOs across Africa and America, documenting the difference between leaders who built sustainable companies and those who built toxic ones. The pattern was clear. Leaders who treated service workers, assistants, and subordinates with casual cruelty inevitably created dysfunctional organizations. The cruelty trickled down. Trust evaporated. The best talent left. Short-term profits masked long-term rot. After graduating, Diana joined Pan-Africa Connect, but not in a corner office. Her father insisted she start in operations, visiting rural tower installations, working with local teams, understanding the business from the ground up. She spent 2 years traveling to small towns across Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria, meeting the technicians and community liaisons who made the infrastructure work. She learned languages: Yoruba, Swahili, Igbo, beyond the English and French she already spoke. She learned to read people, to distinguish between respect and performance, between genuine partnership and extraction dressed as opportunity. By 28, she was running African operations for 3 countries, quietly becoming one of her father's most trusted advisors. When Marcus began considering the Hastings Technologies partnership, Diana was his first call. "Read the proposal," Marcus said. "Then tell me about the man, not the company." Diana did her research. She read interviews with Hastings, articles about his management style, Glassdoor reviews from former employees. The pattern emerged: brilliant strategist, terrible leader, high turnover, complaints about belittling junior staff, multiple HR settlements, a culture of fear dressed up as high-performance standards. She presented her findings to her father. "The numbers work, but the man is wrong. He sees Africa as a market to extract value from, not a partner to build with." Marcus nodded. "I suspect you're right. But suspicion isn't certainty. We need to know for sure before walking away from $5 billion. That's when Diana suggested the test. "Let me work the final dinner as hotel staff. Put me in a uniform. Make me invisible. I'll serve drinks, clear plates, blend into the background. If he treats me, treats any service worker with basic human respect, maybe I'm wrong about him. Maybe the partnership could work. Marcus considered this. And if you're right about him, Diana smiled, then he'll show us exactly who he is. And we'll know we made the right choice walking away. Marcus approved the plan with one addition. I'll arrive late. Give him time to reveal himself without knowing I'm watching. Just be careful, Diana agreed. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated because of her age, her gender, occasionally her race. She'd learned to use invisibility as a strategic advantage. Richard Hastings was about to learn that lesson too, but in the most expensive way possible. The Peninsula Hotel's private dining room was booked under a shell company name. Hastings arrived at 7 p.m. with his CFO, Linda Wu, and his chief legal counsel, Stephen Davies. They were early, eager, and carrying 2 leather cases containing the final joint venture agreements. The deal structure was impressive. Hastings Technologies would invest $2.3 billion in African infrastructure development, while Pan-Africa Connect would provide ground access and government relationships. Revenue would be split 55 to 45 in Hastings's favor, a split he'd negotiated aggressively, arguing that his technology was the more valuable asset. The projected returns were staggering. Conservative estimates showed $8 billion in revenue over 5 years, with Hastings Technologies positioned to dominate the African cloud services market ahead of all competitors. Wall Street was already anticipating the announcement. Hastings's stock had climbed 23% over the past month on acquisition rumors. Tech journalists were speculating about his next move. Forbes had called him the new king of cloud infrastructure. Tonight was supposed to be a formality. Dinner, signatures, champagne, and press releases prepared for morning distribution. Linda Wu reviewed the documents one final time. Marcus's team agreed to the revenue split, the governance structure, and the IP protections. This is done. We just need his signature. Hastings checked his Patek Philippe watch. He's late. He's African, Stephen Davies said with a slight smirk. Probably their cultural approach to time. The hotel's events coordinator appeared, a polished woman in her 40s. Good evening, gentlemen. Mr. Okonkwo called to say he's running 15 minutes behind. Traffic from the airport. May we begin with drinks and appetizers while you wait? Hastings waved dismissively. Fine. Scotch, neat. Macallan 25 if you have it. Of course, sir. The coordinator left. A moment later, a young black woman in the hotel's staff uniform entered, carrying a silver tray with water glasses and a bottle of San Pellegrino. Her name tag read Diana Price, a common surname she'd chosen specifically for its anonymity. She moved efficiently, placing water glasses at each setting with the trained precision of experienced service staff. Hastings and his team barely registered her presence, deep in conversation about post-announcement media strategy. Diana had worked in restaurants during college, her father's insistence that his children understand service work. So the mechanics were familiar. She'd also spent the afternoon being trained by the Peninsula's actual staff, who believed she was a consultant evaluating guest experience. As she poured water at each place setting, she listened. The key is moving fast once it's signed, Hastings was saying. We integrate their networks into our infrastructure, consolidate operations, and start standardizing everything to our protocols within 6 months. By the time they realize we're running the show, it'll be too late to renegotiate. Linda Wu looked uncomfortable. That's not really the spirit of a joint venture. The spirit is making money, Hastings cut her off. Okonkwo has infrastructure we need. But he's old school. Probably thinks this is about building relationships and uplifting Africa or whatever. We let him believe that. We get the contract signed, and then we operate like the American company we are. Diana's hand was steady as she poured, her expression neutral, but she was recording every word in her memory. Stephen Davies chuckled. You think he'll push back? What's he going to do? Hastings leaned back in his chair. Take us to court in African jurisdictions. We'll have 10 lawyers tying up for years. We'll own the infrastructure. Possession is 9/10 of the law, especially in developing markets. Diana finished pouring and stepped back toward the wall, hands clasped behind her, eyes down. The perfect, invisible servant. She knew 3 things Hastings didn't. First, that everything he'd just said contradicted the relationship-based partnership his team had promised during negotiations. Second, that her father would never sign a deal with someone who saw Africa as something to be exploited rather than partnered with. And third, that the next 60 minutes would determine whether Richard Hastings left this room as a titan of industry or as a cautionary tale about the cost of arrogance. The moment that sealed Richard Hastings's fate happened at 7:34 p.m. over something as small as a water glass. Diana was standing near the serving station when Hastings gestured impatiently. You? More water here. She moved forward with the pitcher, approaching his right side as trained. But as she reached to refill his glass, Stephen Davies shifted in his chair unexpectedly. Bumping her arm, water splashed. Not much. Maybe 2 tablespoons. Onto the leather portfolio sitting beside Hastings's plate. The room went silent. Diana immediately set down the pitcher and reached for her service towel. I apologize, sir. Don't touch it. Hastings' voice cracked like a whip. He grabbed the portfolio, shaking off water droplets, his face flushing red. Do you have any idea what these documents are worth? Sir, I sincerely apologize. If you'll allow me to, how did you even get hired here? Hastings stood now, his 6-foot frame towering over Diana's 5'6". The peninsula is supposed to have standards. Are you incompetent or just stupid? Linda Wu reached out. Richard, it was an accident. Stephen moved. I don't care whose fault it is. Hastings's voice was rising, the stress of 6 months of negotiations finding an outlet. This is a $5 billion deal and some clumsy. He stopped himself, but the word hung in the air unspoken. Diana remained perfectly still, meeting his eyes with a calm that seemed to infuriate him further. She didn't look away, didn't cower, didn't rush to grovel. Years of her father's training, never show fear to bullies, held her steady. That calm made Hastings angrier. People like you, he said, his voice dropping to something colder and more dangerous than shouting, should learn your place. You're here to serve, not to... Richard. The voice from the doorway was quiet, but every person in the room heard it clearly. Marcus Okonkwo stood in the entrance, still wearing his travel coat, his expression unreadable. Behind him stood 2 men in suits, his security detail, and the hotel's general manager, whose face had gone pale. Hastings turned, his anger transforming into forced joviality in an instant. Marcus, you're here. We had a small incident with the staff, but I saw. Marcus stepped into the room, his eyes moving from Hastings to Diana and back. I arrived 5 minutes ago. I was standing in the hallway, reviewing some documents, when I heard raised voices. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Marcus walked slowly to Diana, ignoring Hastings completely. Are you all right? Diana nodded once. Yes, sir. Good. Marcus turned to Hastings, and now there was something in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold assessment, like a surgeon examining a tumor. Mr. Hastings, I'd like you to meet someone. This is Diana Okonkwo, my youngest daughter. She's been running operations for 3 of our African divisions for the past 2 years. She's also the person who's been evaluating whether your company would be a suitable partner for our expansion. The silence that followed was absolute. Hastings's mouth opened, closed, opened again. You didn't know. Marcus's voice remained perfectly level. Yes, that was rather the point. Linda Wu stood abruptly, her face flushed. Mr. Okonkwo, there's been a misunderstanding. If you'd known she was my daughter, Marcus interrupted gently, your CEO would have behaved differently. That is precisely the problem. He walked to the table, standing across from where Hastings remained frozen. Let me tell you what I saw in the hallway, Mr. Hastings. I saw you berate a young woman over an accident that wasn't her fault. I heard you question her intelligence, her competence, and her place. I heard you use the phrase, people like you, with a tone I've heard many times in my life, usually from people who believe some humans are worth less than others based on how they look or what work they do. I didn't mean Hastings's usual eloquence had abandoned him. You meant exactly what you said. Diana spoke for the first time since her father arrived, her voice steady. Because you've said similar things before. I read 43 Glassdoor reviews from your former employees. 15 mentioned demeaning behavior toward junior staff. 8 specifically mentioned racial comments. Your head of diversity resigned last year, citing a hostile environment for people of color in leadership. She removed the small hotel notepad from her apron pocket. Tonight, before you knew who I was, I heard you describe African markets as places to extract value from, rather than partner with. I heard you plan to consolidate operations and standardize to your protocols, despite promising my father a collaborative joint venture. You literally said, by the time they realize we're running the show, it'll be too late to renegotiate. Linda Wu closed her eyes. Richard, I have 6 months of research on your company, Diana continued, her calm more devastating than any anger could be. Your technology is impressive. Your business model is sound. But your character, the way you treat people when you think no one important is watching, that's disqualifying. Marcus placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. In my culture, Mr. Hastings, we have a saying, you can't build a house on a rotten foundation. You cannot build a partnership on disrespect. You cannot do business in Africa. In 17, nations with rich cultures and proud people, if you see them as resources to exploit rather than partners to honor. He gestured to the leather portfolios, containing the unsigned agreements. You wanted my signature on a $5 billion deal. You were willing to say whatever I wanted to hear, promise whatever I wanted to hear, as long as you got what you wanted. Marcus picked up one of the portfolios and handed it to Hastings. Here is what I want you to hear now. No. The deal is off. Not renegotiable, not subject to better terms, not available at any price. Simply no. Richard Hastings found his voice, and with it, his usual aggression. You're walking away from $5 billion because of a misunderstanding with hotel staff? I'm walking away, Marcus said, his tone hardening slightly, because you just demonstrated exactly who you are. And I don't do business with people like you. This is insane. Hastings turned to his team. Linda, Stephen, talk sense here. This is racism, Diana said quietly. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. The casual kind. The kind where you automatically assume a young black woman in a uniform must be incompetent, must be stupid, must not deserve basic human respect. The kind where you don't even notice you're doing it because you've done it your whole life. I have black employees, Hastings protested. I've donated to racial justice causes. I'm not. You have black employees you're polite to when they're in positions of power, Marcus interrupted, because that serves your interests. But the moment you encounter someone you perceive as powerless, someone serving you water, your true character emerges. That's the test, Mr. Hastings. Not how you treat people who can help you, but how you treat people who can't. He walked to the window, looking out over Beverly Hills. I've been in business for 34 years. I've met thousands of potential partners. I've learned that a person's character under stress, toward subordinates, when they think no one important is watching, that's the truest predictor of how they'll behave when a partnership gets difficult. And partnerships always get difficult. Marcus turned back. You showed me tonight that when things go wrong, and in a $5 billion joint venture spanning 17 countries, things will go wrong. You respond with cruelty toward whoever is closest and most vulnerable. You blame, you demean, you assert dominance. That's not leadership. That's bullying. And I will not bring that into African markets where I've spent 30 years building relationships based on mutual respect. Stephen Davies, seeing his career evaporating, tried a different approach. Mr. Okonkwo, with all due respect, this seems like a rather extreme reaction to— Let me tell you what's extreme. Diana cut him off, her voice sharp now. Extreme is the 22-year-old assistant who quit your company last year after your CEO called her a diversity hire who didn't belong in meetings. Extreme is the Nigerian contractor who you refused to pay full invoicing to because, in your words, labor is cheaper over there. Extreme is building an entire business strategy around extracting value from African markets while calling it partnership. She pulled out her phone, opening a voice memo app. I've been recording this dinner since I entered the room. It's legal in California, one-party consent state. I have every word you said about consolidating operations, about standardizing to your protocols, about moving fast before we realize you're running the show. Hastings went pale. You can't. That's entrapment. It's due diligence, Marcus said coldly. The kind you should have done on me. Did you know that before I built telecom networks, I taught business ethics at University of Lagos? Did you know I've written 2 books on sustainable partnership models in emerging markets? Did you know I once walked away from a $300 million deal because the potential partner used a racial slur about my assistant? He moved toward the door. You didn't know because you didn't care. You saw an old African businessman you could charm and manipulate. You thought I'd be impressed by your Stanford pedigree and your Forbes profile? You thought flattery and projections would be enough. You made one critical error, Mr. Hastings. You assumed that because I needed your technology, I needed it more than I needed to protect my integrity and the dignity of the people I serve. You were wrong. The turning point came not from Marcus or Diana, but from Linda Wu. He's right, Richard. Every head turned. Linda set down her water glass with a steady hand, her expression exhausted. He's right about all of it. I've watched you operate for 5 years. I've made excuses, told myself you were just demanding or passionate or results-driven. But tonight, she looked at Diana. I'm sorry. For what he said to you, and for not saying something sooner to stop it. Linda, Hastings's voice carried a warning. No. Linda stood. I'm done. Mr. Okonkwo, you asked earlier if Richard's behavior was an anomaly. It's not. This is who he is when he thinks he has power over someone. I've seen him reduce assistants to tears. I've watched him pass over qualified candidates of color for promotions while claiming culture fit concerns. I've read the HR reports he's had legal settlements suppress. She pulled a USB drive from her briefcase. This contains documentation of 12 HR complaints filed against Richard over the past 3 years. Complaints about hostile work environment, discriminatory behavior, retaliation. His father's position on the board kept most of it quiet. You're fired, Hastings said flatly. I quit 3 weeks ago, Linda replied. I've been waiting for this deal to close so I could take my stock options and leave. But watching this tonight, watching him treat your daughter like that, I realize some money isn't worth the cost. She placed the USB drive on the table in front of Marcus. You'll want this before you make any future business decisions involving Hastings Technologies. Diana picked up the drive, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes showed gratitude. Stephen Davies was already packing his briefcase. Marcus, I think we're done here. We are indeed, Marcus agreed. Hastings stood alone now, his face cycling through rage, disbelief, and finally, something that might have been fear. You're making a mistake, You need this partnership. No, Marcus said simply. I need partners I can trust. I need partners who understand that how you treat people who can't fight back says everything about whether you'll honor agreements when circumstances change. And I need to look myself in the mirror without shame. He extended his hand to Diana. Shall we? Diana removed her apron, folded it neatly on the serving station, and took her father's arm. They walked toward the door together. Behind them, Richard Hastings stood in the ruins of his $5 billion deal, surrounded by scattered papers and the heavy silence of consequences finally catching up to character. The Peninsula Hotel hallway felt quieter than it should have been. Marcus and Diana walked slowly, her hand still on his arm, both processing what had just happened. Are you all right? Marcus asked quietly. Diana nodded. I've been called worse. Hell, I've been treated worse. But having the power to walk away from it? To make that racism cost him something real? That feels different. Good different. Complicated different. Diana stopped, leaning against the marble wall. Part of me wanted to reveal who I was immediately. Watch him panic. Make him squirm. But that would have been about my ego. Letting it play out, collecting evidence, showing him that his behavior has consequences beyond hurt feelings. That was strategic. Marcus smiled slightly. You've learned well. I had a good teacher. Diana pulled out her phone, looking at the recording app that had captured everything. What do we do with this? That's your decision. You're the one he disrespected, Diana thought carefully. We don't release it publicly. That would be about revenge, but I do think his board should see it, along with Linda's HR documentation. Let them decide what kind of company they want to run. And the partnership? There are 3 other American tech companies interested in African expansion. I've been vetting them for the past 2 months, in case Hastings turned out to be exactly what I suspected he was. Diana scrolled through her notes. Nexus Cloud Systems, smaller than Hastings, but the CEO is a woman who built her company on ethical tech principles. Their proposal is more conservative, maybe $3 billion instead of 5, but their model is actually collaborative. Equal profit sharing, local hiring commitments, technology transfer agreements that build African capacity instead of extracting it. Marcus nodded slowly. Set up a meeting. Let's see if they treat waiters with respect. Diana laughed, the tension finally breaking. I'll wear my uniform again. Absolutely not. Once was clever. Twice is paranoia. Marcus's expression softened. Besides, I want them to see you for who you actually are from the beginning. The brilliant strategist who's going to be running Pan-America Connect in 10 years, whether they partner with us or not. They walked toward the hotel exit, leaving behind the wreckage of Richard Hastings' arrogance and the beginning of something better built on actual respect. The news broke 36 hours later, not through official press releases, but through Wall Street whispers that traveled faster than any announcement could. Okonkwo Hastings' deal collapsed. $5 billion gone. Personal conflict. Sources say. Hastings Technologies' stock dropped 31% in 2 days. Investors, spooked by losing the African expansion that had been priced into valuations, began dumping shares. 3 board members demanded emergency meetings. Richard Hastings' father, the retired founder, called from his vacation home in Aspen, his fury burning through the phone line. Meanwhile, tech journalism went into overdrive speculating about what happened. The official statement from Pan-Africa Connect was diplomatically vague. After careful consideration, we have determined that our partnership objectives and corporate values were not sufficiently aligned to move forward. But Linda Wu, freed from her NDA by constructive termination, gave a carefully worded interview to The Information. There were fundamental differences in how the 2 companies viewed African partnerships, whether it was extractive or collaborative. Those differences proved irreconcilable. Tech Twitter exploded with speculation. Had Hastings tried to renegotiate terms? Had Okonkwo discovered financial problems? Was there a competing offer? Only 4 people knew the full truth: Marcus, Diana, Linda, and Richard Hastings himself. And Hastings wasn't talking. Diana spent the aftermath doing something that surprised even her father. She reached out privately to 3 junior employees at Hastings Technologies, 2 black women and 1 Latino man, who'd filed HR complaints that Linda's USB drive had documented. She offered them jobs at Pan-Africa Connect. All 3 accepted. "You're hiring from his company?" Marcus asked with raised eyebrows. "I'm hiring talented people who deserved better than they got," Diana corrected. People he overlooked or dismissed because he couldn't see past his own biases. "They'll do brilliant work for us, and he'll have to watch them succeed somewhere else." 2 weeks after the dinner, Diana got an unexpected email. It was from a journalist at Bloomberg who'd been tipped off about the real story. Not by Diana or Marcus, but by Stephen Davies, Hastings' own lawyer, whose conscience apparently had limits. "I'm working on a piece about workplace culture and corporate partnerships," the journalist wrote. "Multiple sources have mentioned an incident at the Peninsula Hotel. Would you be willing to comment?" Diana stared at the email for a long moment, then forwarded it to her father with a single question. "Do we go public?" Marcus's reply came 2 minutes later. "Your story, your choice. Whatever you decide, I support you." Diana thought about all the young women of color working in corporate America, facing casual dismissal and microaggressions, wondering if speaking up was worth the cost. She hit reply and began typing. The Bloomberg article, published 3 weeks after the incident, titled "When Character Costs Billions, How Workplace Behavior Killed a 5B Tech Deal." Diana participated on the record, though she kept the details measured, professional, focused on business implications rather than personal drama. "Corporate culture isn't separate from business strategy," she told the journalist. "How a CEO treats employees, especially those with less power, directly predicts how they'll treat partners when agreements become inconvenient." The article included corroboration from Linda Wu and 2 former Hastings Technologies employees who described similar incidents. It included expert commentary from business ethicists about character due diligence in major partnerships. And it included a devastating detail. Hastings had spilled his own water on those documents, not Diana, a fact confirmed by the hotel's security footage that Marcus had quietly requested and preserved. The impact was immediate. 3 major institutional investors issued statements questioning Hastings Technologies' board governance. 2 Fortune 500 clients put new contracts under review, citing cultural concerns. Harvard Business School announced it was developing a case study on the incident for its ethics curriculum. Richard Hastings issued a statement through lawyers. "I regret any misunderstanding that occurred during a high-stress business negotiation. I have deep respect for people of all backgrounds and remain committed to diversity and inclusion." The statement convinced exactly no one. But the real earthquake came 6 weeks later when the Hastings Technologies board, facing mounting pressure from investors, announced that Richard Hastings was stepping down to pursue other opportunities. His father's influence could protect him from HR complaints but couldn't protect him from shareholders demanding accountability. Diana read the announcement from her office in Lagos, where she was meeting with engineers about the new data center project, the one that would now be partnered with Nexus Cloud Systems instead, on terms that actually benefited African workers and infrastructure. She allowed herself a small smile, then returned to work. There was too much real progress to make to spend time celebrating someone else's downfall. 6 months after that dinner, Diana was invited to speak at a conference on ethical business practices in emerging markets. Near the end of her talk, someone asked the question she'd been expecting. "Do you regret the way the situation unfolded? $5 billion is a lot of money to walk away from." Diana considered her answer carefully. My father taught me that you can't build sustainable partnerships on fundamental disrespect. The deal would have been worth $5 billion on paper, but it would have been built on extraction, on someone who saw African markets as resources to exploit rather than communities to serve. That kind of partnership doesn't last. It collapses eventually, usually taking workers' jobs and local economies down with it. She paused. What I don't regret is refusing to accept that disrespect is just the price of doing business. That racism is something you have to tolerate to get ahead. Because every time someone powerful faces real consequences for that behavior, not just a diversity training session, but actual material loss, it sends a message that might change the next person's calculation. The most expensive lesson Richard Hastings ever learned wasn't about business strategy or market analysis. It was that character isn't something you can fake when the stakes are high. It's what you reveal when you think no one important is watching. The audience was silent for a moment. Then someone in the back started clapping, and the applause spread through the auditorium. After the speech, a young black woman approached Diana, probably 23, wearing an intern badge from a major consulting firm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I've been dealing with a manager who, well, situations similar to what you described. I was going to just keep my head down, not make waves. But hearing your story made me realize that silence has a cost, too." Diana took her hand. "Document everything. Trust your instincts. And remember, you're not asking for special treatment. You're asking for the basic respect every person deserves. That's not political. That's not controversial. That's the bare minimum of human decency." The young woman nodded, blinking back tears, and walked away, standing a little straighter. Diana watched her go, thinking about her father's words from that night in Beverly Hills. "You're not doing this for them. You're doing this because some things matter more than deals." Today, Diana Okonkwo runs African operations for Pan-Africa Connect, overseeing partnerships across 19 nations. The Nexus Cloud Systems collaboration has created 2,400 jobs across the continent, with profit-sharing agreements that keep wealth in local communities. Technology transfer programs are training African engineers in advanced cloud infrastructure, building capacity that will last generations. Richard Hastings quietly left Hastings Technologies 6 months after his firing, starting a consulting firm that has struggled to attract clients. His Wikipedia page now includes a section titled Controversies, and his name has become a cautionary tale in business. Schools about the cost of poor character. But perhaps the most important ripple effect happened in thousands of offices, conference rooms, and boardrooms where leaders paused before dismissing someone, before speaking carelessly to service workers, before assuming that people like you meant anything other than fellow human beings deserving of respect. Because, in the end, Diana didn't just walk away from a bad deal. She sent a message that echoed far beyond one dinner, one CEO, one $5 billion partnership. The message was simple. Character matters. Respect isn't optional. And invisible people aren't powerless. They're just underestimated until the exact moment when being underestimated becomes your most expensive mistake. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever witnessed someone's true character emerge when they thought no one important was watching. Because power doesn't reveal character. It amplifies what was already there. And sometimes, the person serving your water is the most important person in the room. You just don't know it yet.